There is a machine part so simple that most people have never thought about it. You have seen it 1,000 times without knowing what it was. A ring of polished steel balls trapped between two metal races, spinning in silence, reducing friction to almost nothing. A ball bearing. It sits inside the wheel hub of your car. It sits inside the electric motor of your refrigerator. It sits inside the turbine of a jet engine and the spindle of a dentist's drill. Anywhere two surfaces need to move against each other without destroying themselves, a ball bearing makes it possible. It is the most invisible, most essential, most taken-for-granted component in the entire history of mechanical engineering. In 1943, the ball bearing was also the most fought-over object in the Second World War. More fought over than oil, more fought over than rubber, more fought over than uranium. Because without ball bearings, nothing moved. Not tanks, not aircraft engines, not submarine periscopes, not gun turrets, not torpedo mechanisms, not the wheels of locomotives that carried ammunition to the front, not the lathes and milling machines that made the guns and the shells and the engines in the first place. Every machine in every factory in every country at war depended on ball bearings the way a human body depends on joints. Remove the bearings, and the machine seizes. The gears grind, the shafts overheat, the engine tears itself apart. Think about what that means in concrete terms. A single Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter required dozens of ball bearings in its Daimler-Benz engine, its propeller reduction gear, its landing gear retraction mechanism, its gun synchronization system, and its instrument panel. A Tiger tank needed bearings in its Maybach engine, its transmission, its turret traverse mechanism, its road wheels, and its gun elevation system. A lathe in a factory used bearings in its spindle, its headstock, its tailstock, and its carriage. And the factory that made the lathe used bearings in its own machinery. The dependency was recursive, fractal, infinite. Bearings made the machines that made the machines that made the weapons that fought the war. Remove them from the chain, and the entire edifice of industrial civilization collapses, not in months, in weeks. And in 1943, the largest manufacturer of ball bearings on Earth was not in Germany. It was not in the United States. It was not in Britain or Japan or the Soviet Union. It was in Sweden, a neutral country, a country that was selling bearings to both sides. And the company that made them was called SKF. Svenska Kullagerfabriken, the Swedish Ball Bearing Company, founded on February 16, 1907 in Göteborg by a 30-year-old maintenance engineer named Sven Wingquist, who was tired of broken machinery. The story of SKF begins, improbably, with clay. The Gamlestadens textile factory in Göteborg was built on soft clay soil that shifted with the seasons and the weather. The main drive shafts that powered the factory's looms ran on bearings that could not tolerate the slight misalignments caused by the settling and shifting of the building's foundations. The shafts bent, the bearings seized, the machinery stopped. Production halted while workers replaced the failed bearings again and again in a cycle of breakdown and repair that was costing the factory money and driving its maintenance engineer to distraction. Wingquist studied the problem with the patience of a man who knows the answer is in front of him if he can only see it. He read the work of Richard Striebeck, a German scientist at the Institute of Technology in Dresden, who had conducted careful comparative studies of ball bearings versus plain bearings. He examined the imported bearings the factory was using and understood their fundamental limitation. A conventional single-row ball bearing requires nearly perfect alignment between the shaft and the housing. Any misalignment, even a fraction of a degree, loads the balls unevenly, concentrates stress on one side of the race, and accelerates failure. In a building on clay, perfect alignment was impossible. The bearings were designed for a world that did not exist. In the spring of 1907, Wingquist presented his solution, a double-row self-aligning ball bearing with a spherical outer race shared by both rows of balls.
The inner ring could tilt freely within the outer ring, without binding, without concentrating load, without damaging the balls or the races. The bearing compensated for the imperfections of the real world: bent shafts, settling foundations, thermal expansion, vibration, the thousand small misalignments that are the normal condition of real machinery in real buildings. It was an engineering solution so elegant that it seemed obvious in retrospect, the way all great inventions do. The owners of the textile factory, led by Axel Carlander, recognized the commercial potential immediately. They provided initial capital, and Svenska Kullagerfabriken was born. Vinquist filed for a Swedish patent on February 16, 1907, and within months had filed in 10 additional countries, including Germany, France, England, and the United States. The product sold itself. Vinquist traveled across Sweden, visiting over 100 factories, and most placed orders. Within 3 years, SKF had 325 employees and a subsidiary in Britain. By 1912, the company was represented in 32 countries. By 1930, it employed over 21,000 people in 12 manufacturing facilities worldwide. The largest factory outside Sweden was in Philadelphia. 2 of SKF's young employees, Assar Gabrielson and Gustaf Larsson, used the company's financial support to found Volvo in 1926. SKF was not just a bearing company, it was an incubator of Swedish industrial capitalism, a global enterprise that had grown from a maintenance engineer's frustration with clay soil into one of the most important manufacturing corporations on Earth. By the 1930s, SKF was a global empire with subsidiaries on every continent. Its German subsidiary, VKF, operated major plants, including critical facilities at Schweinfurt, a quiet Bavarian city on the Main River that had become, almost by accident, the ball-bearing capital of the world. Schweinfurt was also home to Kugelfischer, another major bearing manufacturer. Together, the VKF and Kugelfischer plants produced a staggering concentration of Germany's total ball-bearing output. The Kugelfischer plant alone accounted for 22%. The 2 VKF factories added another 20%. Nearly half of every bearing Germany made came from one mid-sized city on a Bavarian river. The SKF subsidiary in the United States, SKF Industries, was based in Philadelphia with 8,000 employees and was one of the largest bearing manufacturers in the Western Hemisphere. The subsidiary in Britain supplied the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. SKF's corporate structure was a perfect mirror of the geopolitical situation, a Swedish parent company with children on both sides of the coming war. When the war began in September 1939, Sweden declared neutrality. This was not a moral position, it was a survival strategy dictated by geography and military reality. Sweden was surrounded. To the west, Norway would be invaded and occupied by Germany in April 1940 in a lightning campaign that took barely 2 months. To the east, Finland was fighting a desperate winter war against the Soviet Union. To the south, Denmark was overrun by the Wehrmacht on April 9, 1940 in a single morning, the fastest conquest in the history of modern warfare. The Skagerrak Strait between Norway and Denmark, Sweden's only sea route to the Atlantic and the Allied world, was now controlled by the German Navy and the Luftwaffe. Sweden was, in practical terms, enclosed within the German sphere of influence, a neutral island in an Axis sea. Swedish diplomats and historians have described the early war years as bearing the impress of the problem of double negotiations. Sweden had to trade with both sides, or at least appear willing to, while being geographically trapped in a position where Germany held most of the leverage. Sweden's economy depended on imports that could only come through German-controlled territory or through the narrow window of safe conduct shipping that both the Germans and British grudgingly allowed. Sweden needed coal from Germany, millions of tons per year. It needed chemicals, fertilizers, coke, and manufactured goods that it could not produce domestically. Without German coal, Swedish factories would stop. Without German fertilizers, Swedish agriculture would falter. Without coke for its steel industry, Sweden's own manufacturing capacity would be crippled. And Germany needed what Sweden had: iron ore from the mines of Kiruna and Gällivare in the far north, the highest-grade iron ore in Europe, containing 60 to 70% pure iron, essential for making the premium steel that built German tanks, artillery, warship armor, and aircraft engine components. Millions of tons per year flowed south through the port of Luleå on the Baltic in summer and through the Norwegian port of Narvik in winter. And ball bearings. Germany needed Swedish ball bearings with a desperation that grew more acute with every passing year of the war, as bombing damage, production disruptions, and the insatiable appetite of a multi-front war consumed bearings faster than German domestic industry could replace them.
The relationship was not voluntary in the way a peacetime trade deal is voluntary. It was coerced by geography and military reality. Sweden traded with Germany because the alternative was invasion. The Swedish government understood, without anyone needing to state it explicitly, that a refusal to supply iron ore and ball bearings would provoke a German military response that Sweden's modest defense forces could not withstand. Norway had been invaded to secure the iron ore route through Narvik. Denmark had been invaded to secure the approach to Norway. Sweden had every reason to believe it would be next if it defied Berlin. So Sweden traded. It shipped iron ore, it shipped ball bearings from the SKF factories in Göteborg. And it allowed German military trains to transit Swedish territory to occupied Norway, a concession that haunts Swedish national memory to this day. But Sweden also traded with the Allies, not as openly, not as voluminously, but consistently and with increasing deliberateness as the war turned against Germany. Swedish ball bearings were smuggled to Britain in daring covert operations. In a series of missions organized by a British naval attaché named George Binney, small, fast ships ran the German naval blockade of the Skagerrak at night, carrying cargoes of ball bearings, specialty steel, and machine tools from Göteborg to British ports. The operations, codenamed Domine, the blockade busters, were dangerous. Several ships were lost. Men died. But the cargoes got through, and the bearings they carried were critical to British aircraft production. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the power plant of the Spitfire and the Lancaster, required precision bearings that Britain could not produce in sufficient quality or quantity. Swedish SKF bearings filled the gap. The Allies understood the importance of ball bearings to the German war machine. American and British intelligence analysts had identified Schweinfurt as a critical vulnerability in the German industrial network. The logic was compelling. Germany consumed roughly 200 million bearings per year. A large proportion of that production was concentrated in a single city. Destroy the factories at Schweinfurt, and you would cripple German military production across every sector simultaneously, from aircraft to tanks to submarines to the machine tools that made everything else. It was the ultimate strategic bombing target, a single pressure point whose destruction would ripple through the entire enemy war economy. The 8th Air Force acted on this logic on August 17, 1943, in the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, one of the most ambitious and costly operations in the history of air warfare. 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses launched from bases across East Anglia in a two-pronged attack. One force, led by Colonel Curtis LeMay, would hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and then fly south over the Alps to land in North Africa. The second force, commanded by Brigadier General Robert Williams, would attack the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The plan was to split the Luftwaffe's fighter response between two widely separated targets. The plan relied on timing. It depended on the two forces launching within minutes of each other. And the plan went wrong almost immediately. Fog delayed the Schweinfurt force by 3.5 hours. The Regensburg force went in first, as planned, but the delay meant that the German fighters that had attacked the Regensburg bombers had time to land, refuel, rearm, and take off again to intercept the Schweinfurt force. The Americans flew into a gauntlet. The bomber crews flew at 23,000 feet in unpressurized, uninsulated aircraft. The outside air temperature was 30 degrees below zero. Frostbite was a constant companion. Oxygen masks were essential for survival, and a damaged oxygen line could kill a crewman in minutes. Flak, the German anti-aircraft artillery, threw shells that burst in black flowers of shrapnel at the bomber's altitude, and the fighters came in waves. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s attacked from the front, the side, from above, and below. Some fired BR-21 unguided rockets from beyond the range of the bomber's defensive machine guns. Junkers 88 twin-engine fighters lobbed rockets into the bomber formations from a distance, then closed in with cannons. The attacks continued for hours. The 1st Bombardment Wing lost 36 B-17s over Schweinfurt, 360 men. Each bomber that went down carried 10 crewmen. Some bailed out and became prisoners. Some burned. Some rode their shattered aircraft into the German countryside. The 91st Bomb Group lost 43% of its crews. The 181st lost 50%. 1 out of every 2 men who flew with the 381st that morning did not come home that evening. The survivors landed at their English bases shaking to their core. The damage to the Schweinfurt factories was significant, with 80 direct hits on 2 main plants and 20 more on a third. American intelligence estimated that bearing production had been reduced by 34 to 40%, but the estimate was optimistic, and the reduction was temporary.
The Americans needed to go back. They went back on October 14, 1943, the day that would be known forever after as Black Thursday. 291 B-17s attacked Schweinfurt for the second time. The lessons of August should have improved the outcome. Planners added fighter escorts to the outbound and return legs of the mission, P-47 Thunderbolts that could protect the bombers as far as the German border. But the Thunderbolts were inexplicably not fitted with drop tanks that would have extended their range. One fighter group was diverted to escort a diversionary mission. The result was that the bombers flew deep into Germany without fighter cover, exactly as they had in August. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German radar had tracked the formations from the English coast. Fighter controllers vectored interceptors into the bomber stream as soon as the P-47 escorts turned back. The attacks began over the German border and continued without let-up to the target and back. The path to Schweinfurt was marked by the smoke and fire of burning B-17s falling from formation. Crews in the trailing 3rd Bomb Division could see the wreckage of the leading formations ahead of them, columns of black smoke rising from the German countryside like terrible signposts pointing the way to the target. 60 B-17s were shot down. Another 121 returned with battle damage. Of 2,900 crewmen who flew the mission, 650 were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. 22% of the bomber crews. The 306th Bomb Group lost 100 men, 35 killed and 65 captured. The 305th Bomb Group lost 130 men. The losses were catastrophic. The American official history acknowledged that the 8th Air Force had, for the time being, lost air superiority over Germany. Deep penetration raids without long-range escort were suspended. The bombers would not return to Schweinfurt for 4 months until the P-51 Mustang arrived in sufficient numbers to escort them all the way to the target and back. The damage to Schweinfurt was again substantial and again temporary. Ball bearing production was halted for approximately 6 weeks. Then the Germans rebuilt. They repaired the machinery. They dispersed production to smaller facilities across the country, moving bearing lathes and grinding machines to basements, garages, tunnels, and improvised workshops scattered through dozens of cities and towns. And they increased imports from neutral countries, from Sweden, from Switzerland, from anywhere that could sell them the precision steel spheres they needed. This is where the story of SKF becomes a story of moral ambiguity, diplomatic pressure, and the cold arithmetic of neutrality. After the Schweinfurt raids, the importance of Swedish ball bearing exports to Germany increased dramatically. Before the raids, Swedish bearings had been a useful supplement to German domestic production. After the raids, with German factories damaged and production disrupted, Swedish bearings became a critical lifeline. The German government pressured Sweden to increase deliveries. Allied intelligence estimated that by late 1943 and early 1944, SKF might be supplying as much as 70% of Germany's needs for certain specialized bearings that could not be easily manufactured elsewhere. The 63mm bearings used in German tank production, for example, were especially sensitive to supply disruption, and Sweden was a primary source. The Allies responded with a campaign of diplomatic pressure, economic warfare, and barely concealed threats. In September 1943, the Swedish government had signed a tripartite trade agreement with Britain and the United States that set quotas on Swedish exports to Germany. The agreement was supposed to limit ball bearing exports to approximately 29 million kroner for 1944. But the Allies wanted more. They wanted a complete embargo. Sweden refused. The Swedish Foreign Office cited its existing commercial agreements with Germany and the 1944 quotas that had already been negotiated. The Swedes understood that cutting off Germany entirely would invite retaliation, possibly including military action. Coal shipments from Germany could be halted. Fertilizer supplies could be cut. The Swedish economy, already strained by wartime isolation, could be pushed into crisis. The Allies escalated. In early 1944, Allied negotiators bypassed the Swedish government entirely and opened direct negotiations with SKF. The logic was brutal. SKF was a private company. Its parent company was in Sweden, but its subsidiaries were in Allied countries. SKF Industries in Philadelphia was producing bearings for the American military. The American government could exert pressure on the subsidiary and through the subsidiary on the parent. The tools of coercion were financial. The U.S. Treasury revoked permission for SKF Industries to send dividends to Sweden. The State Department threatened to blacklist all Swedish companies with affiliations in the United States, freezing approximately $125 million in Swedish connected assets. The message was unmistakable. Stop selling to Germany, or we will destroy your American business. There were darker threats. The U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe, under General Karl Spaatz, suggested to General Eisenhower that the Allies consider bombing the SKF factories in Göteborg directly. The suggestion was explosive. Bombing a factory in a neutral country would be an act of war against Sweden. It would shatter the fiction of Swedish neutrality, potentially drive Sweden into the German camp, create a diplomatic catastrophe with every other neutral nation on Earth, and raise profound questions about what exactly the Allies were fighting for. The suggestion was not formally adopted as policy, but its existence was communicated through diplomatic channels that ensured the Swedes heard about it. The threat did not need to be official to be effective. The knowledge that American bombers, the same bombers that had leveled Schweinfurt and lost 60 aircraft doing it, might be redirected toward Göteborg was sufficient to concentrate Swedish minds on the urgency of the situation. The Office of Strategic Services, the American wartime intelligence agency and forerunner to the CIA, had agents inside the SKF factory in Göteborg monitoring shipments. OSS Stockholm provided regular reports to Washington on the flow of bearings from Sweden to Germany, documenting quantities, types, destinations, and delivery schedules with the precision of an accountant auditing a hostile company. There was no hiding behind the fog of neutrality. The Allies knew exactly what SKF was selling, how much, and to whom. Every bearing that left the Göteborg factory for a German customer was noted, recorded, and added to the diplomatic leverage that the Allies were accumulating for the confrontation to come.
Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening in Philadelphia. The workers at SKF Industries, the American subsidiary, had learned through rumor and newspaper reports that their Swedish parent company was selling bearings to Germany. The reaction was fury. These were American workers, many with sons and brothers in the military, producing bearings for the American war effort. The idea that the same company, under the same corporate umbrella, was also supplying the enemy was intolerable. Production was threatened. Morale collapsed. Workers questioned whether the bearings they were making might somehow end up in German hands. The crisis required immediate intervention. William Batt, the president of SKF Industries and vice chairman of the War Production Board, flew to Philadelphia. Flanked by Army and Navy officials, he stood on a flag-draped platform before 8,000 workers and assured them that SKF Industries was an American company operated by American people. The Treasury Department and the alien property custodian publicly praised the subsidiary's excellent war production record. But the assurances were awkward because the questions the workers were asking had no comfortable answers. SKF Industries was legally American. Its management was American. Its workers were American. But its parent company, which owned the majority of its shares, was selling ball bearings to the Wehrmacht. The corporate structure that had made SKF a global colossus in peacetime had become an impossible moral and legal tangle in wartime. In May 1944, the American government sent Stanton Griffiths to Stockholm as the chief negotiator. Griffiths was a shrewd, well-connected businessman who chaired the executive committee of Paramount Pictures and had the kind of polished ruthlessness that effective economic warfare requires. He carried both a carrot and a stick. The carrot was an offer of up to $30 million to purchase SKF's entire output for the duration of the war, a preemptive purchase that would leave nothing for Germany. It was an enormous sum, equivalent to roughly $500 million today. The stick was everything else: blacklisting of all Swedish-affiliated companies in the United States, freezing of $125 million in Swedish-connected assets, permanent revocation of dividend transfers, loss of access to American markets, and the unspoken but clearly understood possibility that the 8th Air Force might pay a visit to Göteborg. The negotiations were tense and protracted. SKF was caught between two forces that could each destroy it. If the company cut off Germany, it risked immediate retaliation from the Reich. The Germans could seize the VKF subsidiary factories on German soil, facilities that were worth far more than anything the Allies were offering. They could cut off coal supplies to Sweden. They could, in extremis, invade. If SKF refused the Allies, it risked losing its American subsidiary, its British subsidiary, its access to global markets after the war, and possibly its physical plant in Göteborg. The company's management, influenced by the powerful Wallenberg banking family that controlled much of Swedish industry, understood that they were navigating a shrinking space where every decision had consequences measured in lives, money, and national survival. There was no good option, there were only degrees of bad. On May 13, 1944, SKF stopped all shipments to Germany as an interim measure while negotiations continued. A settlement was reached on June 12, whereby the company would dramatically reduce its bearing exports to Germany, limiting total shipments to 770,000 kroner per month, of which only 470,000 would go to Germany. This was a fraction of previous deliveries. The Germans were furious. During the half-yearly trade negotiations in late July 1944, German negotiators displayed what Swedish diplomats described as evident irritation at the manner in which the Swedes had yielded to Allied pressure. But there was nothing Germany could do. By mid-1944, the Wehrmacht was in retreat on every front. The invasion of Normandy had succeeded. The Red Army was rolling west through Poland. Germany's ability to coerce Sweden had evaporated with its military fortunes. The irony of the entire ball-bearing saga was that the strategic bombing of Schweinfurt, the raids that had cost the 8th Air Force so dearly in blood and machines, had achieved far less than the American negotiators in Stockholm achieved with diplomatic pressure and financial threats.
Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, the man who ran the German war economy with ruthless efficiency from 1942 onward, wrote after the war that a sustained, concentrated campaign against German ball bearing production could have paralyzed significant sections of German industry. He was specific. As early as September 20, 1942, Speer had warned Hitler that the ball-bearing facilities in Schweinfurt were crucial to the entire German war effort. Hitler ordered increased anti-aircraft protection for the city. But Speer's real fear was not one raid or two. His fear was a sustained campaign, raid after raid, week after week, that would prevent the factories from recovering between attacks. That campaign never materialized.
After Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids into Germany for 4 months. The losses were simply unsustainable. Bomber crews could not statistically survive their required 25 mission tours at casualty rates of 20% per mission. The Air Force needed time to rebuild its strength and, critically, to wait for the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, the long-range escort fighter that could accompany the bombers all the way to their targets and back. The Mustang arrived in early 1944 and changed the air war fundamentally. During Big Week in February 1944, the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt and other targets with Mustang escorts, and the losses dropped dramatically. But by then, the Germans had dispersed their bearing production and built up stockpiles that cushioned the impact of any individual raid. The window of vulnerability that Speer had feared, the window in which concentrated attacks could have caused cascading industrial failure, had opened in the autumn of 1943 and closed by the spring of 1944. The 8th Air Force had knocked on the door and paid a terrible price in blood, but it had not sustained the pressure long enough to break through. Meanwhile, the Allied negotiation with SKF had done what the bombs could not. By cutting off the Swedish supply, the Allies eliminated a source of bearings that Germany could not replace through dispersal or stockpiling. The specialized bearings that Sweden manufactured, the high-precision components used in aircraft instruments, gun-laying mechanisms, tank transmissions, and submarine periscopes, were not easily duplicated in improvised workshops. The 63mm bearings critical to German tank production were especially sensitive to supply disruption. Germany could move its domestic production of standard bearings to dispersed facilities, but it could not replicate the quality of SKF's precision output in a basement in the Black Forest. The loss of Swedish bearings, combined with the cumulative damage from bombing and the progressive destruction of German transport networks through 1944, created a tightening noose around the German bearing supply. The ball bearing story also reveals something important about the nature of modern industrial warfare that the air power theorists of the 1930s and 1940s did not fully understand. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany was built on the assumption that there were critical nodes in the enemy's industrial network, single points of failure whose destruction would cause cascading collapses across the entire war economy. Ball bearings were supposed to be the supreme example of such a node. The theory was elegant, the reality was far messier. The Germans proved more adaptable than the bombers expected. They dispersed production, they accumulated reserves, they found substitute designs that used fewer bearings or different types. They imported from neutral countries. They redesigned mechanisms to use plain bearings or needle bearings where ball bearings had been specified. Arthur Harris, the commander of RAF Bomber Command, had questioned from the beginning whether ball bearings were truly a war-winning target. Post-war analysis showed that Harris's skepticism was at least partially justified. By 1945, the Germans had actually assembled more bearing reserves than they had held before the bombing began. What did work in the end was not the bombs alone and not the diplomacy alone, but the convergence of all three forms of pressure applied simultaneously. The Schweinfurt raids damaged German domestic production and forced the costly dispersal of manufacturing. The diplomatic pressure on Sweden cut off an alternative supply that could have compensated for domestic losses, and the continuing Allied air campaign against German transport infrastructure, the systematic destruction of rail marshalling yards and bridges and river crossings and canal locks that accelerated relentlessly through 1944, prevented the Germans from moving the bearings they did have to the factories that needed them. A bearing sitting in a warehouse in Stuttgart was useless if the rail line to the tank factory in Kassel had been bombed. It was the convergence of production damage, supply cutoff, and transport destruction that finally created the bearing bottleneck Speer had feared. No single form of pressure would have been sufficient. All three together were devastating. There is one more dimension to this story that demands attention. The VKF ball bearing works at Erkner, a suburb 7 miles east of central Berlin, was an SKF subsidiary operating on German soil. When the 8th Air Force bombed Erkner on March 6, 1944, as part of the first large-scale daylight bombing of Berlin, it was bombing a Swedish-owned factory. The American military deliberately referred to the target as the VKF ball bearing works rather than the SKF ball bearing works to avoid the diplomatic embarrassment of publicly acknowledging that they were destroying the property of a neutral country's most important industrial corporation. The distinction was cosmetic. The factory belonged to SKF. The workers were German. The bearings they made went into German weapons, and the bombs that fell on it were American. The name on the mission briefing changed nothing about what was happening. The broader moral question of Swedish neutrality has been debated for 80 years and will probably be debated for 80 more. It is a question without a clean answer because neutrality in a total war is never clean. Sweden's defenders argue that it was the only rational choice for a small country of 6 million people surrounded by hostile or occupied neighbors. Denmark fell in 6 hours. Norway fell in 2 months. Finland was bleeding against the Soviet Union. Sweden had no allies, no defensible geography against a German invasion from occupied Norway, and an economy that depended on imports of coal, chemicals, and manufactured goods that could only come through German-controlled territory. Trade with Germany was a survival mechanism, not a moral endorsement, and Sweden simultaneously provided critical aid to the Allies through covert bearing shipments, intelligence cooperation, and the sheltering of refugees. In October 1943, when the Germans ordered the deportation of Denmark's Jewish population, Swedish fishermen and volunteers ferried nearly all of them, approximately 7,000 people, across the Öresund Strait to safety. Sweden sheltered tens of thousands of Norwegian and Finnish refugees. It served as a base for Allied intelligence operations throughout the war.
Sweden's critics make a different argument. Swedish iron ore built German tanks. Swedish ball bearings kept German aircraft engines, submarine periscopes, and tank transmissions running. Swedish railroads carried German troops through Swedish territory to occupied Norway, a permission granted under duress, but granted nonetheless. The profits from this trade enriched Swedish companies and banks, including the Wallenberg banking dynasty, which controlled not only SKF, but a vast network of Swedish industrial and financial enterprises. The Wallenberg connection adds a further layer of moral complexity that defies simple judgment. Raoul Wallenberg, a member of the same banking family that profited from SKF's wartime trade, was dispatched to Budapest in 1944 on a mission funded partly by the American War Refugee Board. Using diplomatic cover and extraordinary personal courage, he issued protective passports and established safe houses that saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews from deportation to Auschwitz. The same family that sold ball bearings to the German war machine also produced one of the most celebrated rescuers of Jewish lives in the entire war. History does not simplify. History does not allow you to separate the hero from the profiteer when they share a last name. 650 men were lost over Schweinfurt on Black Thursday alone. Add the losses from the August raid, the Erkner mission, the Big Week raids, and the dozens of smaller bearing-related sorties, and the toll climbs into the thousands. Thousands of young Americans, average age 22, who climbed into thin-skinned aluminum bombers at dawn and flew 5 miles above the Earth into a sky filled with flak and fighters for the purpose of destroying buildings that contained machines that made small steel spheres. The air crew of the 8th Air Force paid for the ball-bearing campaign with their bodies, their sanity, and their lives. The negotiators in Stockholm paid for it with threats, money, and the cold leverage of American economic power. The Swedish government paid for it with the compromise of its neutrality, a neutrality that had already been compromised in 100 other ways by the impossible geography of a small country caught between great powers at war. And SKF survived. The company survived the war, survived the moral reckonings that followed, survived the decades of debate about Swedish neutrality, and survived into the 21st century as one of the largest bearing manufacturers in the world. Its factories still operate in Göteborg. Its products are still inside every machine, every motor, every turbine, every wheel hub on Earth. In 2023, a Russian missile struck an SKF factory in Ukraine, killing 3 employees. The echoes of the wartime story, neutral technology caught in the crossfire of great power conflict, continue to reverberate. The ball bearing, that humble ring of steel spheres, is still the most invisible and most indispensable component in the mechanical world. But for a few years in the middle of the 20th century, it was not invisible at all. For a few years, it was the most strategically important object on the planet. Nations bombed cities to destroy it. Nations threatened to bomb neutral countries to stop its export. Hundreds of men died in a single afternoon trying to prevent its manufacture. Diplomats offered $30 million to buy every last one. Spies monitored its shipment from inside the factories. And a Swedish company, caught between 2 sides of the greatest war in human history, sold it to both. Because that is what neutrality looks like when the world is on fire. Not a moral stand, not a principled position. A calculation, a survival mechanism. A business decision made in a burning world by men who understood that the small steel spheres rolling in polished races inside every machine on Earth were not just industrial components. They were the joints of civilization. And whoever controlled them controlled the war.